Welcome to another Bible study here at Trinity Church. The last few days we've been in Matthew chapter 13, and we've been looking at the parables which Jesus gave to his disciples and those gathered there. Today we're going to look at part one of a two-part lesson, and that first part is where Jesus gives the parable of the tares amongst the wheat. Now, many people either dismiss this completely as just some kind of metaphoric picture of the church in everyday living, or they see it as a picture of the end of the world, or the end of the age, shall we say. Jesus identifies it as such later on in the chapter, and that will be part two. But for the first part of this today, we're just going to look at what it says in the text and start to put the picture together. Because we'll find out that as the disciples, the apostles, and the people who are with them are gathered listening to Jesus teach, they don't get it. In fact, they ask later on in the chapter here, would you mind interpreting that for us? And that's what we'll discuss in the next lesson. So first of all, let's read Matthew chapter 13, starting in verses 24. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. And while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat. And then he went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' And he said, 'No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow them both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up. But then gather the wheat into my barn.'" This is a very, very important lesson to the church as we see it today, and how we can apply the truth of what Jesus is saying in this parable today, and then how we can look forward to what is coming when Christ returns. Now, let's look at this a little bit. First of all, he says that he sows good seed. He doesn't sow just ordinary seed. He doesn't sow, whatever, just, I got to throw some wheat out in the field. It says the qualitative statement of the seed is good. It's solid. It takes deep roots. It receives the nourishment. This is the good seed. Okay? We talked a few lessons back about the different types of people in a congregation, and in the church and in Christian faith at large, basically. And what that was important to know was that some people really dig down in and get it, and they're there for the long haul, and they got it, and they're not worried about what's sitting in the pew next to them. They're not worried about everything else. They're worried about who they're going to win for Christ and how they're going to live an exemplary Christ-like existence in the world we live in today. So it says he sowed good seed. And then he said, while his men, his slaves, as they're called later on in this parable, were sleeping, and people are allowed to sleep, but there's also a point where sometimes we as the workers in God's field, we take a break. Be that good or bad. In Revelation chapter 3, we see where that can be difficultly wrong. But we'll not concentrate on that in this particular parable. He says then, while they were sleeping, that his enemy came in and sowed tares amongst the wheat in his field. The landowner realizes this. Now, the word enemy here in the Greek is more like the word we would call competitor. What I would compare it to would be the guy up the street who's growing the exact same type of grain or close to it, and he wants to have the price he wants for his grain, so he's going to try to eliminate the farm down the road's grain so he can get a better price for his. This word competitor has some connective fingerling roots to the same word that John the Evangelist uses in his epistles when he talks about the spirit of Antichristos. or the Antichrist, the spirit of Antichrist. Now what we must understand is that the word Antichrist is never used in the New Testament as a person. It's always a spirit of, or some type of psychological movement that is spiritual in nature. Okay? And I know there's an argument for all of this, and if you believe differently, it's okay. This is the way the scriptures tell us, and that's the way we understand them, and that's the way we read them in their original intent, not how they've been interpreted since the early 19th century. So, we see that the tares have been sowed amongst the wheat by the competitor, by the guy up the street who wants to get rid of his neighbor's crop so he can get a better price for his crop. And then the slaves, or the people working the field for the landowner, they go to the landowner first. Now they could have just said, yeah, let's go out and pull the tares. Okay? But they went to the landowner first. This is very important, because what they're doing is what we should do. Whenever there's a problem in the church, we don't take care of it ourselves. We go to Christ. We go to Jesus and ask him for advice, go to his word, and seek out what the solution is. Not just saying, well, I don't like the way you did that. So, and there are tares in every congregation. There are people who look like Christians but aren't. There are people who may even talk like it to a certain point, yet you'll know the boundaries. But they're not. And they're there to cause trouble or to get their way or to manipulate people for money or whatever it is. And they might be in the pastoral staff, and they might just be in the congregation. There's tares everywhere. I've pastored 3 churches now, and all 3 of them had tares. And you know what? You go to Christ and you ask him for the solution. And that's what the workers did. They went the right way first to the landowner and said, do you want us to go in and pull the tares out? And he says, very simply, no. Because if you go in now while they aren't full grown and you start yanking the tares out, you're liable to destroy some of the grain too. And that's good seed. And I want that to grow and mature so that we have a bountiful harvest. I think you're following me. Now, where it gets interesting is he says, but when they mature and when they're full grown, then you go in and you pull the tares first and you burn them. And he says, then after that, you go in and you gather the wheat, the good seed, the wheat, and you bring it into my barn. There's a chronology here, okay? And the chronology isn't what we've typically been taught. But that's really not the points that I want to make here. There's a process by which Jesus Christ is using to teach his disciples that we as Christians need to mature and grow to be what we are supposed to be in our full measure in Ephesians chapter 4, to the full stature of the person of Christ, to look and to walk and to talk like Jesus Christ. Not like the world. We don't think like the world. We don't act like the world. We act like Jesus Christ. And that's how the world is evangelized. Now, the interesting thing about it is Jesus then goes on to teach about the mustard seed parable. And if you didn't see that one, you need to go back and review that, and we'll talk about that. But right after that, he gives one short parable called the parable of the leaven. And we need to connect this to what Jesus is saying about this wheat in the field that is maturing and growing and doing what it should. And he says in verse 33, and he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven yeast, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. What happened? Well, it spread, it grew, and it filtered into the rest of the flour, and so that it was all had the amount of leaven in it that it could be used to make bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. See, there's just so many neat ways to tie this stuff together. Okay? And so this woman put an equal measure of leaven or yeast into the flour, and it spread into it and completely did what it should and mixed into it completely. and changed it and transformed it. That's evangelism. That's how we mature, by sharing our faith and growing in that. And sooner or later, then that becomes full. And the leaven is where it should be. The flour is what it should be. It can be made into bread. And that is the spiritual bread of life. Now, this is very, very important to understand this, because he tells this story, and then we see that it says he doesn't speak to them anymore in just common language. He doesn't just say, hey, how you doing, Peter? What's going on over there, Philip and Andrew? What's happening? He only talks to them in parables, and parables are symbolic stories that have a spiritual reality or a spiritual lesson to them that we have to learn. And when we pass over the parables lightly and we take them superficially for what we think they're probably just saying as, and I don't mean this derogatorily, but as a Sunday school lesson, we miss the real depth. So Jesus tells of this field, and then he changes the subject and he goes to the mustard seed parable, and then after the mustard seed parable he goes to this one about leaven, and then it stops. And that's where we're going to pick up tomorrow in our lesson then.